I'll be talking and talking. So let me share my screen. We're joined by Jason, as y'all saw, joining in the session. But I want to go over some announcements. I know a lot of times we run out of time and I don't actually get to go through these. So before we start, I did want to start with, we have an event June 5th. We have Cisco Live June 8th through the 12th. I will be there. So if you're there, please do make a shout out. June 25th, we have a Hyperfabric Roadshow in King of Prussia. There's an AM session and there's also a PM session. And then just some other announcements based on today's topic. Cisco has published some free Splunk training, and that's where you can go into the intricacies of what's SIM, what's SOAR, what's XDR, what is Splunk, and we'll be covering a lot of that topic today. And then just a call out, please look at Jason Maynard's YouTube channel. It's fantastic. I've learned a lot from there even before I joined Cisco, so it's kind of cool to have him on with us because I've been watching him before then. Just a little look at the training. This is about what it looks like. So you'll see a lot of this verbiage today. Please check it out after this. It is free. Our Philly Select website, it's pretty basic. There's 2 pages. One is the homepage, and that's the events page. And then we have the tap room where you'll find all the recordings from our previous tap sessions. And do I have any other announcements? That is it. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Jason.
Awesome. Thanks so much. I'm assuming everyone can hear me.
Yes, sir.
Awesome. All right, I'm going to share my video. You guys see my screen?
Almost.
Not yet.
Starting to share.
I might have to stop my video here for some reason. It's slow. Just do that. Still nothing?
Still nothing. Oh,
There
there
we
we
go.
are.
All right. Awesome. All right. I have some PC issues anyway, so 100% utilization half the time because I don't want to close tabs, but I bet that's the life we all live. Anyways, I'm Jason Maynard, Field CTO for cybersecurity at Cisco. I've been with Cisco for about 13 years. Previous to that, I've worked at a partner integrator where I led their network and security practice. And then previous to that, I've been an end user. So I've got different perspectives because I've lived the full life cycle, right? As consumer, right? Or customer, partner integrator, and then manufacturer. So hopefully I can give a different perspective as we go along here. So we're going to talk a little bit about incident response with XDR and Splunk specifically, and kind of show a little bit of the differences of the capabilities, because I think there's a little bit of confusion of, where does XDR start and end, and where does SIM SOAR kind of kick in, right? And so we'll talk about some of the differentiators and where the opportunities are. All right, let's get into it. So if you look at the market itself, there's two pieces, right? There's what we've been doing for a long time with SIM. And when I say SIM, I'm saying SIM in general. I'm not talking specific products here, but a lot of things that we leverage SIM for is regulatory and compliance and long-term storage of data, and might do some correlation. But it never helped with incident response as it was happening, right? It's good for historical queries and data lookups, but if something's happening live, at the moment, then it wasn't great. It still helped, but you ended up finding that you were in every single tool trying to figure things out, right? And that's really where XDR came in. And so with XDR, the first thing, some of the differentiators, right? It's lower effort. You don't need a ton of expertise to leverage and get value out of the product almost immediately. The data is curated, right? But it's not there for long-term storage. That's the biggest thing, right? It's not going to be a place where you put data for 7 years and you're going to go back to it. That's not the point of the tool. It does come with a data repository, because in order to correlate between all the individual events that you might see with an extended detection response, you need to collect data, right? And then you get some really interesting things around automation, depending on the tools that you're leveraging. Certainly with Cisco XDR, there's the ability to not only support integrations with Cisco technology, but even go a little bit further and support curated, validated integrations with third party. So that includes things like CrowdStrike or SentinelOne or Defender. And that's a big game changer, because what it means to you is that you can use the best technology that you might have in the organization. Cisco's got an EDR technology as well. But the point here is that all of your investments should be leveraged, not just the investments that you've made with Cisco. And it should be fully supported. This is not an integration guide that we throw you. This is, in fact, if you call us and say, I've updated CrowdStrike, or Defender had a patch, or XDR, Cisco's XDR was updated, something's broke, you call Cisco and we'll support you through that entire life cycle. We have a direct channel to the development teams on our integration partners. So again, some value there. The other thing we'll talk about is progressive disclosure. We're going to get a little bit deeper into XDR in a second. So that's kind of like the high level. One of the things that we've also introduced into the platform is automation, and what we call is low to no code automation and playbooks. And so it's just a simple mechanism that you guys can leverage to build more sophisticated playbooks within the platform to respond as you're going through an incident, or as you're starting to collect telemetry that suggests bad is happening, right? We can automate that response for you. SIM and SOAR, a little bit different, right? It's higher effort. There's usually a level of expertise that's required here, but there's unlimited value, right? The art of the possibles here. You can do some really crazy stuff. I'm going to talk about some of the things that I've been talking to people about, and they get really excited about, what you're telling me we can add context to a threat that we might have seen in the organization from a business lens perspective. And that's where you start getting into things like observability. And this is, I think, where the market's a little bit shifting, is that you're starting to see that SIM isn't necessarily going to be an independent capability. You're going to need to collect things around the business and the context of things and observability. And if you marry the two, there's a tremendous opportunity here. And I'll kind of go over what that might look like in the near future. Any source at any scale, extended storage, 7+ years compliance or governance, if you need to keep data for a long period of time, this is what you're going to leverage, right? You're typically going to send data to SIM. The goal here ultimately is that for frontline incident response, you're going to use XDR. And then what you're going to use for longer term storage and maybe some more advanced correlation and analytics, you're going to use SIM and then SOAR. But they shouldn't be independent of each other, right? They should be considered, part of the same offering, in the sense that if I'm in XDR and I need to pivot into SIM, I should be able to pivot into SIM and look at historical records and maybe cross-correlate this even further than the incident at hand. Same thing, if I'm in SIM and I'm seeing something of interest, I should be able to take that data point and very quickly pivot into XDR and do a threat hunt across the entire organization instantly. And that's what you're able to do with both XDR and SIM and SOAR. Now,
Hey, Jason,
yeah,
sorry to interrupt. Some of your WebEx stuff is on the screen. I don't know if you can move that. I
some of
can't
my,
see the top left.
oh, it shouldn't show you that. That's weird.
Yeah,
Is that better?
it's just, yep. It is an incognito, but it's just like blocked, so we can't read it, whatever it is. But
Oh,
yep,
yeah.
that's better. We
Yeah.
can see the whole slide now.
Okay, thanks for that. Yeah, it's supposed to, any of the controls on WebEx should be transparent, like you wouldn't see them. But anyways, we're good. Then you have artificial intelligence on top of this. And so, there's a whole marketing push around AI, a lot of hype around AI, but there's some tremendous value that AI gives you. And that's the ability to be able to ask it in real time, based on human language questions, and query a ton of data and get some very curated results back to allow you to action. So some value there. We'll talk a little bit more about that. And then you have threat intelligence, right? Obviously powered by Cisco, but you also want to be able to consume third-party intelligence and potentially input your own private intelligence into the platform, and then ultimately incident response. So when you look at some of the problem statements, right? XDR, well, it'd be something like an incident that's taken place where PowerShell's created an internal connection that maybe is never seen before, right? Could be ransomware, might not, but maybe the network had detected something in the environment that it hadn't seen before and was able to tie that back to PowerShell that made the actual connection. SIM, on the other hand, is good at answering very complex questions, right? So this one's the example here is view prioritized alerts based on risk from a certain location, in this case, the UK. And you might be focusing on, multiple different observations / indicators as well. And then you get into SOAR, and now you get into, very sophisticated workflows. And so this example here is initiating a password reset for all UK employees based on 3 observations that we may have seen over a period of time, right? And we want to quarantine the affected endpoints, take a snapshot of it, of all the data centers that potentially, or data sources that it's potentially touched. So it can be very, very elaborate. Now you can do that with XDR. You can do some of the automation here as well, but you're not going to get the long-term telemetry that's in the platform to be able to correlate against. And that's really where then SOAR comes in. Now, this is the interesting thing. I put this together recently, talking to a large airport authority, and they were looking at, they like the idea of tying the physical into the IT world. So, for example, like a badge reader that you might use to, to get into a building, could you tie that into an MFA platform? And certainly you can do that today. And they thought, okay, that's really cool. And then we talked a little bit about XDR and SIM and how that starts to come together. And they said their biggest gap is this, right? They don't understand the context of the applications themselves. And so there's some gaps there understanding true risk. And then I went through this scenario with them. So, I'm up here in Canada. You have an individual that connects to a chatbot and is asking a bunch of questions around changing their home address, maybe for a shipment, for whatever reason. And that connects to an Ottawa IP address, right? Like that the individual's connecting is from Ottawa, the IP's from Ottawa, and it's working through this. But the chatbot says, wait a minute, this is great. I think I know who you are, but I can't really validate that, right? And so I'm going to give you a ticket number, and I'm going to give you the number. Call back in, reference the ticket number. They're going to ask you some additional questions. And then from there, they probably will be able to change your name. So again, a caller calls in, this time maybe from a different geo. I usually pick on Russia just because it's easy. But let's assume they're calling in from Russia. So there's a caller ID. They call the call center. They reference the ticket number. They have enough information of the adversary. And, it satisfies the needs, and they change the address. Now, this log here with this ticket number and the Ottawa IP address, this is just in a application. That's it. Like, it didn't trigger a firewall rule. There's nothing necessarily nefarious here. No SIM is looking at this data whatsoever. And same thing with the caller ID, right? Now, in the application, there might be some checks and balances, but again, this is in the application. Most likely your security tools are not going to catch any of this, right? They're not even going to see it. But what if we then say, you know what, we've got this information, we probably capture this data for the SLA targets that we might be trying to achieve. And so that data is there because Splunk specifically is more than a SIM, right? It's a digital data analytics platform. We now have the ability to parse that data. And what if 3 weeks previous, now this is where things get really interesting. What if 3 weeks earlier that geo IP address, that Ottawa IP address actually triggered an intrusion event within our IPS, and it's now already in SIM and it was blocked, right? Because it did something that was bad to match the signature and we blocked it. That's great, it blocked it, but the problem is that nobody looked at that. And nobody would. And why would you? But if I'm able now to take those three pieces and pull them together, all of a sudden now I've got a high severity alert. So maybe 3 weeks ago, the adversary tried to knock on the door, tried to maybe compromise an asset, failed, and then took a different path, right? And it's all within the business application itself. We would fail to even know that this took place. So this is where the art of the possible comes in with SIM. You just can't do this type of activity with an extended detection response platform. So as you start to climb up, XDR becomes foundational to real-time attack. So this is where we're going to, as an incident occurs, we're going to correlate the data between your endpoint detection response, your network detection response, identity threat detection. They're all going to come together, and we're going to build out what we call attack chains. We'll talk about that in a second. And then you're going to, have SIM, for long-term storage. You're going to do some risk-based detections. You're going to cross-correlate data. And then eventually you get to SOAR, where you're doing unlimited automation. And then maybe at some point you move to TDIR, right? Threat detection, investigate, and respond. And so if you look at what we see here, the integration is key, because what we do is we end up doing real-time threat hunting, incident response, leveraging XDR, but have the ability to integrate and do further investigations with long-term storage with Splunk or SIM. Now, you might just start here for some things, right? It doesn't mean you always start here. Sometimes you might even be in a tool like EDR, because you saw an alert there. So you may not start in XDR, but the goal here is to allow you to very quickly pivot into the tools to tell the entire story. That's the goal here. All right, let's talk a little bit about XDR specifically, and because there's tremendous value in this. And you might be thinking, okay, well, I don't have SIM. We are looking at SIM. What you might find, again, SIM has a specific set of requirements. You might find that you're better suited with XDR. Again, depending on the requirements. If you don't have anything and you're trying to get better visibility across the entire organization and be able to respond quickly, then again, it might be XDR. If you're doing something a little bit more sophisticated around data and long-term storage and doing risk profiling and things like that, then again, you're probably looking at SIM. But the goal with XDR specifically is really to build the story for you, right? To pull all the telemetry sources that you have within the organization, whether it's EDR, network detection response, regardless, right? Identity threat, in the cloud, flow logs. We're going to capture it all. We're going to feed it into that data repo, and then we're going to crunch the data, right? And we're going to try to figure out what the relationships of each one of these independent observations from all these independent tools and what their relationships to one another might be. Now, there's going to be times that there is no relationship, and that's okay. But there's going to be other times that there is. And so we're going to want to know, listen, if I found an adversary that was able to get ransomware into the environment, how did that happen? Well, maybe it was through an email. The user clicked a link. It used DNS to go to that questionable link, right? And then a strange process started on the endpoint, made a connection out to a couple of other assets, also reached out to a couple of IPs on the internet, and bad happened, right? And so you want to be able to tell the story, and we're going to show that shortly. So the goal is to detect sooner. Context is key. I talked about business context from the SIM perspective. When I talk about context on XDR or even in SIM, we want to understand the asset, everything about the asset. So, what are the current posture settings on the asset? Who's, assigned to that asset? What the version of Windows is there vulnerabilities associated? That context is critically important to understand, maybe how things went wrong. The other thing is to understand the identity. So the individual that is maybe connected to this asset, if it is a user that's assigned to an asset, I want to know everything about that identity, right? I want to know if there's risks associated to the identity itself, like if MFA is enabled or not. Do we have multiple identity sources? What's the relationship between those identities from a risk perspective? That's all going to help me make better decisions. So when something bad happens, I can certainly prioritize this. And then the goal is to reduce investigation time and accelerate response. So high level architecture on this side, don't care, right? It could be any vendor. The goal here is to pull everything together into one cohesive place where you can actually get answers to and identify the relationships between each independent observation. That comes in multiple different forms. It comes in raw telemetry, events, threat intelligence, and so on. And then there's some magic that happens right under the hood. This is where we do behavioral analytics, anomaly detection. Attack chaining is really interesting, and I'll talk about that in a second. And then incident response, creation and then prioritization of the incident first. And then we move into response. And response could be a manual effort, right? So maybe you just want to go to a firewall and block a bad IP, right? Or you go to a switch port and you block the port because you know that they're propagating in the environment. Obviously, yeah,
So I have a question.
yeah.
So for like, this is amazing. This is where everybody wants to be. I mean, that's the goal. And like you said, there's a lot of different vendors in that environment. When we talk about XDR, and we're going to get into that easy connection, that number one on your last slide, what does that integration look like for people who are kind of new to this to get from there to here?
Yeah, great question, Eric. Yeah, so we haven't talked around integration. We're going to get to that piece shortly, but let me just jump to that real quick. Most integrations is just a simple API connection between the products. Whether it's Cisco or third party, it's typically that simple. I think there's a video on YouTube. One of my colleagues has created like 30 integrations in 3 minutes with Cisco XDR. And it's just copy and pasting between the different platforms for the most part. So it's fairly simple. The difference will be, and again, I'm going to get into this in a second, is that some integrations may have more or less capabilities. And that's not a lack of what Cisco offers. It might be a limitation within the API of the vendor itself. If we can shut down a port, or we can shut down, or block connections to the internet from an operating system, well, we're going to do that, right? If that's what you want to do, because risk is high. But if the technology doesn't allow that change through API, then certainly we can't do that. So continuing on, manual response is one thing, right? But that's not where you want to go. You want to be able to automate the response. Now, in the tool, you should be able to right click and take action. And you don't need to log into EDR or the firewall or in the cloud service provider network, or you can drive that outcome again, because those integrations are API. You're going to be able to make the change into the infrastructure without actually having to log into multiple different tools. And there's tons of benefits to that, right? Because now you don't necessarily have to get many different teams involved to take action. Now, you still may have to follow change requests. Maybe this is an emergency change, but the point here is that you've removed and abstracted the complexity. And we'll talk about that very, very shortly. So you've got all these different integrations. You've got flow data from AWS, Azure, Google that comes into XDR. And again, API integration. You have your network, right? There's NAC and other technologies that are in there that provide tremendous amount of telemetry, firewalls that all can be fed in. And these are flow logs. These are letting us understand the environment. This is where we get that network detection and response capability in the platform. And we give this to you natively. This is something that's interesting and unique as well, because Cisco XDR includes two key capabilities by default. One is network detection and response. We can expand on that with another tool within Cisco, but it inherently gives you network detection and response. And the other thing that we've added is identity threat detection and response. So you can tie this into your identity providers, and we're going to tell you the risk profile associated to those identities. The other one is context on the endpoint, and I'm going to get to that in a second. So we take flow, then we got syslog from firewalls, you got remote workers where we're actually collecting IP fixed data from that endpoint and feeding it into the platform. Again, the network tells a story, and so there's tremendous value in that. Then third-party intelligence, including Talos, will feed into the platform, and then your integrations. And that integrations, as I mentioned, is a very simple API integration for the most part. And these events will be fed in, as well as device insights. This is what's going to tell us the story around the endpoint itself. So things like, is antivirus enabled? What does Windows Security Center say? All of that good telemetry, right? Whose assets logged in, who the person is that's logged into the asset. And again, the reason why this is important is that when you're looking at an incident, I can very quickly see, oh, it's Jason, he's from IT. Like this is high risk. So the SOC operator all of a sudden knows, or analyst knows what's going on and the risk profile potentially associated to the asset, the identity. And then you've got API integration on top of that. And so what happens is these technologies feed into XDR and further enrich the platform itself. And you can see that there's different capabilities depending on certain integrations that we may be collecting that data from. So we might be able to do enrichment and maybe in other tools we can do enrichment and alerting, or in some things we'll do device data, and that's all it does. So the whole thing here is around not only collecting all the disparate observations, but also giving you clear indications of what the judgment is on those specific observations. So, you could have multiple judgments that may suggest something is bad, but ultimately there's a verdict that says, listen, it's malicious. And usually we take the worst scenario as gospel because maybe they know something that somebody else doesn't, and therefore we're going to take that as that's the severity level that we're going to go with. And as you're investigating, you're going to be able to ask it things very, very quickly, like what is the IP? Or sorry, not what is it? Here's the IP. Can you go tell me where I've seen any connections to that IP, right? Or here's a SHA 256. Tell me if I've seen this. Well, yeah, you've seen it on these 4 endpoints that's assigned to these certain identities that actually has also been seen on 3 different firewalls. And it's going to build that picture. And then what we do is start augmenting that, right? We start augmenting it with additional telemetry because as we start to investigate, there might be relationships between these independent pieces to what we're investigating now. So we got global intelligence that comes in, right? VirusTotal, other third parties, Cisco, Talos. They're going to come in and they're going to let us know, are these observations suspicious or malicious? Ultimately, and then you've got local security context. So have we seen these observations in our network? So you can take a shot very quickly within, less than a minute, right? You're going to get the data back, and I'll show you that in a second. And then response, right? And the goal with Cisco XDR specifically is to make sure that you can action without leaving the platform. Now, there's a couple things that we've added in here. One is progressive disclosure. And so what that means is there's AI in the platform that allows us to tell the story to the analyst at the right stage of their investigation. So not overwhelm them with data, but provide them the right information at the right time to allow them to make the fastest decision to remediate risk. And what happens there is twofold. One is they know more sooner, right? They're not overwhelmed. And 2, they can take action right from the platform without having to leave it. And then 3, what happens is that now a tier 1 analyst can actually execute tier 2 activities because AI has augmented, they've got like this AI or SOC assistant that's tied to that tier 1 analyst, so it can ask questions and say, or they can ask questions and say, what should I do? What is my next step in this process? And AI is going to say, well, you know what? Maybe we should quarantine these assets. Here's the assets that you might want to quarantine, and go ahead and deliver against that outcome if you want to do that. Or do you want me to do that, right? And that allows the analyst to get or do more without being, a senior individual. Likewise, tier 2 analysts can do tier 3 activities. So you just get more overall value. And at the end of the day, your team's able to respond quicker. That's the goal. So this is basically what happens. Analyst comes in, all these integrations are done through APIs. They go ahead and ask that question. It goes out and, reaches out to all the technologies. They come back. And then what they do is they provide an answer. And again, if they contradict each other, we're going to take the highest severity, most likely, and go with that. So with detections, we've got behavioral, we've got cloud alerts. So we can look at things in AWS as an example, like EC2 instance has started. You might want to know about that. Global threat alerts, there's some machine learning capabilities obviously built in. We've got the ability to detect threats and encrypted traffic without decrypting it. That is a little bit unique to Cisco. We take telemetry from the network, fingerprint it basically, and then we augment that with additional telemetry. And with high levels of efficacy, we can tell you whether or not it's a threat without ever having to decrypt that traffic. And then threat intelligence. We've got public cloud detections, network and endpoint detections, and these are, again, are early warning triggers that would happen in the environment. For example, you may not know the compromise has taken place because a defensive capability has failed, but all of a sudden assets doing SMB 445 probes on your network. Well, you probably want to know about that, and that's an indication of something is obviously suspect, because that would actually just trigger a signature, because that's not a normal activity. On the other end of it, we can also baseline the environment to know what normal looks like. So all of a sudden, Johnny comes into work and connects to 15 different servers that they've never connected to before and is pulling a bunch of data down to their local asset. Well, you might want to know about that. Now, maybe their role has changed and it's Monday morning and they're coming in and that's why the change of behavior, or it could be something nefarious. And then it's about that correlation piece, right? So what is the relationship between this executable and Cisco.com and this SHA and this email and this IP address? You've been left with trying to pull the pieces together to build the story. The goal here is to let XDR build that story for you. And what it does is it looks for those relationships between each one of those observations and tries to tell that story for you. And then builds out what we call our chaining patterns or attack chains. So now you have full visibility. And the really cool thing is with AI, we have the ability to build the reports for you at the end of it. Everything that you've done, we've captured and correlated over the period of time. And then you can very quickly go into AI and tell me, hey, tell me what the executive report looks like. And it'll do that for you. Now, this is where I'm talking about progressive disclosure. So an analyst would have went in here and clicked on one of these, and this little drawer would open up. And that drawer then gives you a long description and a short description and a summary of the event. It allows the analyst very quickly to see the MITRE attack, or so tactics and techniques that might have been used in this particular incident. It looks at the priority score, gives them some quick information to make, or her, the decision as quick as possible. And then they could drill into the incident themselves further if they choose to do so, because they need more information. Sometimes they're going to have to do that, right? They just don't have enough information to make a decision, and therefore they're going to investigate further. The goal here is to keep you in the tool. We allow you to pivot into other tools like Splunk and others, endpoint detection response. You can do that. But our goal is to keep you here because we want to make sure all the information is collected in one place for you to make the decision and not have to jump out to multiple different interfaces. That's the goal of the technology. Now, risk is how do we calculate it? It's a priority score from 0 to 1,000. We take detection risk, and we get this from what we've classified to see if there's a tactic or technique that's used in an organization. What do we typically see around the financial risk when certain TTPs are used in an organization and they've been breached? So we've tied, a financial risk to that. Then the number of TTPs that might have been seen, again, through the collection of observations that we've reviewed, and then the source severity, right? The severity of the source coming in. That'll give us a detection risk, and then we multiply that by the asset value. So if the asset value is 8 and the detection risk is 92, that gives us 742. So that's how we kind of classify it. And then we give it a severity score, and you can see it's very visual here. And what I mentioned earlier, he said something about being able to make decisions sooner. And I see at the top, you've got overview, detection, response, workload. So I go into response, well, actually, see this little arrow here? Any one of these, I can drop down and take action. So maybe there's enough information here: critical, confirmed threat, insider. Maybe I want to quarantine this or block this particular IP address from happening. So if it's external, maybe I want to send this to the firewall. If it's internal, maybe I want to use a NAC, like Identity Services Engine, and isolate the endpoint. And so very quickly, as I mentioned, see, click here. It's going to tell you all the TTPs that are associated with that particular incident. It's going to show you, when you go into view incident detail, it's going to show you the relationships between each observation that we have seen here and collected. And that's a quick view of that. I've kind of broken it up in a different way in a second, so I'll show you that. Filtering obviously is something that you can do, but as you go through, and we use the PISROL or PICROL, it depends on who you talk to, process for SANS, for incident response. And so, you get an overview, then we get into detection, and then response. Now we get into that process that SANS calls out: identification, containment, eradication, and recovery. And anything that says add note just means that there's no integration currently in place today, but you can certainly track what you're doing if it's a manual effort. In this case, if it was an action, I could very quickly come in and take action against that. Everything's logged, right? So it's got a full work log that everybody's doing, whether it's through automation or through a human. We're going to log everything, and it'll be part of that executive summary at the end. So nothing is missed. So response actions, you can pivot, as I mentioned, right at the very first screen you get to. You can take action wherever that little drop down arrow thing is, right? You can do it through playbooks and automation. So you might have playbooks that you invoke or are automatically invoked that does a bunch of stuff, and response could be one of those things that it does. It can even do things like, here's an incident. We've got something from an email, and let's put that attachment, throw it in a malware sandbox. Let's get the report. We're going to add 4 people into a WebEx Teams room. We're going to then put the report in the room for them and give them the link to the directly to the incident. That can all be done through automation, right? You can build a playbook, and there's some already there for those types of activities that says something comes in, it's bad, then kick off this workflow and make sure that you're putting, the 3 leaders and a couple of technical gurus, right, into a room. But they shouldn't have to go find the attachment and then go throw it in a malware analytics box, go wait for the report to be. We're going to do that and already have it done before they even get to the room itself. All right, so I'm going to skip a couple of these. This is showing you some of the workflows that you could get into here, but I'm going to show you an example of why the attack path or attack chain is critically important for 2 sides. One, obviously understanding the threat, but more importantly, it's a great mechanism to know where your defensive should be. And so, this is based on Salt Typhoon. This is just an abstract of it, right? There's certain things they have to do, right? So initial access, execution, persistence, privilege escalation. They'll do lateral movement. 60 to 70% of all breaches include lateral movement. So segmentation's key. Credential access, you got discovery, and then exfiltration, and then impact, right? And so that could be ransomware, data manipulation, service takedown, stuff like that. Once you understand the adversary and they're targeting you, and you do alignment to the MITRE ATT&CK framework, now this is the beautiful thing. Defenders have an opportunity to build in the defensive mechanisms in the right place. And you don't have to be right 100% of the time in 100% of the places. What you have to do is make it very sticky for the adversary in order to get success. So I'm showing you red. Red is a blocking or preventative capability here, and I'm calling out specific technologies that may solve that particular use case. But the adversary is going to use everything in their tool belt, right, to get past any controls. Anything in green, I'm highlighting from a detection perspective. So it's not going to prevent, but it's going to provide detection. When you make this muddy and murky, what happens is you end up buying what I call as time-based defense. You give your team more time to detect the adversary in the network, and you give your defenses or your tools more time to also catch up. So again, if I land here and this is the only way I can get into that system, well, maybe I can't do this and I move on to the next victim, right? If I get past this, then I need to use PowerShell or something like that in order to navigate. If you've taken that away from me, I have to bring in my own tool. If I have to bring in my own tool, it's got to probably go through your next-gen firewall. There's a good chance you're going to catch it. Then if I get past that, I got to then get past your EDR technology that's on the endpoint. So you can see how these layers of opportunity for defenders really start to make it difficult for the adversary. So I'm calling this out a little bit of just perspective of how some of this stuff starts to come together and some of the value. And so I've kept, third-party technologies. So green is Cisco, and you might have some of that. Again, the technology doesn't really matter in this example. And then you might have other vendors. So every color represents a vendor. So you got endpoint detection and response, secure email, next generation firewall, and then you got maybe risk-based multi-factor authentication. And what happens is, and maybe observability. And what happens is you go to market, and every time you go to market, you evaluate it. You got to pick a technology stack that solves the business need. But right now you've got 4 vendors in the organization, right? And every time you add a vendor, you become the system integrator. You own the complexity, and I will say that nobody's solved this case, right? Like everybody's tried this best of something and put it together, but it doesn't keep them out of the news, right? They still get compromised. But let's assume that we're going to try to make this story a little bit better. And what you can do is that's where you introduce something like XDR. Now, XDR will add additional capabilities around device context, network detection response, identity threat detection response, but also will tie in and glue all of these pieces together. And so now what you end up getting is an integrated architecture that can do some really interesting things, right? XDR can see, respond to, an identity that's been at risk and disable it, right? It can go into email and cross-correlate and quarantine maybe a SHA or a specific piece of malware that's been seen. It can use the network to block a printer that's scanning the network at 2 a.m. It can use EDR when you're at the coffee shop and all of a sudden exhibiting a certain behavior. It can go in and say, listen, I'm going to quarantine and only allow you to access 3 different sites, one being XDR, the other being the EDR technology, and then one other site as an example. Same thing with network, same thing with your next-gen firewall, regardless of the vendor. The goal here is to start to pull it all together, right? And so now we've got observability, and how do we actually expand this a little bit further? Well, we can do some stuff like this. You could consolidate. Again, take this with a grain of salt. You're not going to throw it in an existing investment that you just bought. So I would encourage you to continue to leverage that, but see if you can get more orange out of the juice, or more juice out of the orange, sorry, from those third parties. So if you had a Checkpoint, Apollo, of Fortinet, can you get more value? Maybe adding Cisco XDR, maybe. I think you would certainly, and that's the path that you would continue down. But you can add more value to the existing investments. Then you can move to SIM if you only had observability at the time, and vice versa, right? It's just showing a very high level, simple architecture of the value of some of these technologies coming together. But what is really key here is that with SIM, there's a lot of people hesitant because the amount of data that you need to consume. And so with XDR front-ending SIM, specifically on the Splunk side, and it could be any SIM, but what we can do is further optimize to provide high fidelity alerting into the platform. So instead of having, and again, this depends on governance and requirements and things like that, right? Because if you have something that you have to keep logs for 7 years, well, then you got to send it to SIM, right? You absolutely have to do that. But some of these technologies, what you could do is have them feed XDR directly, let it do all of the analysis. Remember, we've simplified the ability to take all those disparate observations, correlate them, and allow you to make an educated response, or take an educated response between all those disparate observations, because now you've got a story. Instead of sending it all directly to SIM, you send it here, let it do that, and then only send the high fidelity outcomes into it. So you can save some data, then you can free up and do some of those creative things I mentioned earlier, where you're taking business context and applications and pulling certain observations in those, that if you were able to tie those to a security event, it would change the way that maybe you approach those types of behaviors, and you probably catch more of those risk factors as well. So again, now we've got this architecture that feeds into Splunk, high fidelity, curated alerts. Again, XDR, low effort, limited expertise. Like, you don't have to be a genius to leverage it. Immediate value, curated data, right? A repo with no additional costs associated with it. Third-party, curated, validated integrations. Automations built into the platform, including playbooks. So there's tons of them that are already created, and you could add more on your own as well. Community and vendor-supported application integration, real-time instant response handling, and threat hunting. And then the big one, progressive disclosure, right? That AI element, that AI assistant that's hanging out with you throughout that process. Splunk, again, we want to optimize the data to let it do the magical things that it can do, right? Unlimited value, the art of the possible. I gave you an example of that earlier on. Now, powerful data analytics capabilities that certainly you can do some really interesting stuff. Extended storage, you're going to meet governance or any compliance requirements. Highly customizable, you've got full orchestration. So again, anything you can dream up, you probably can do, or somebody's already done it. And it's community driven too. That's the other beautiful thing, specifically around Splunk, is that the community is massive, right? They call them Splunkers. Most likely the things that you're envisioning or want to do, that somebody's probably already done it. And worst case is you've got to modify it just slightly, but you don't have to rework it and rethink it and build it all on your own. So this is what we end up getting with collection of data coming into something like XDR. So we saw a threat, and now we know it came in through Outlook.exe. We got resume docm, right, which was executed when launching WinWord. WinWord, when it launched the document, it had a macro in that document. That macro then launched a PowerShell script. That PowerShell script went to a domain, right, or URL called ret.space. And then there was an executable that was run called resume.exe. Now, you'll get this from your EDR technology, right? So that part's easy. But where did it come from, right? That's the first thing. So then what we do is we got information from email, and instead of having you go to email, we stitch that in. And now we know that, how creative I'm being here, at bad.com, whatever. And then 2 victims, right? John and Jason. John was the one that clicked it. Jason, maybe he didn't open the email yet. And maybe we want to quarantine that piece of mail now that we know, and we can action that within XDR. It'll go into email and it'll do that quarantine for you. But John clicked it. So again, we'll quarantine it on John, but John, this is John, right? This is all John. And then what we do is say, okay, what about John's identity? Like, is there some additional insight that we need to understand here? And what we end up finding is, because XDR has that identity threat detection response capability, we've seen maybe MFA flood attacks or compromised sessions, whatever, right? There's been things that have also shown up around John's identity to suggest that there's more going on here than just him clicking a Word document or a resume. And then when we look at the device, we can see that the device has security agents, it's enabled, Windows Security Center's on, vulnerabilities. Maybe there's 3 vulnerabilities on the asset, right? And so maybe we've got to explore that as well. Then what we end up seeing is on the endpoint, again, it makes a connection, compromises a CVE within a printer, and we see data hoarding activity. So large amount of volume coming out of the endpoint onto this printer. You might be thinking, well, why is that happening? Well, what they're trying to do is hide in the environment, collect the data from all the, the assets that they compromise. And then from there, they're going to exfiltrate that data out to something that's pretty common, right? Dropbox, maybe a OneDrive, box, it doesn't really matter. They're going to actually exfiltrate that data. And so that's the story. And that's what you put together with something like XDR. And again, if I need to pivot into SIM, I can do that. If I need to look at Splunk and say, listen, I see this IP, I pivot into XDR so I can build this story immediately in real time as things are happening in the environment. Again, historically, Splunk will do that. But in real time, I'm able to do this in the environment, even with historical data that I might get from Splunk. Now, when we break this up a little bit, what we end up seeing, this is identity threat detection response and device context. This is email intelligence. This is our endpoint detection response capability. And this is our network detection and response tool that provided. So there's 4 different areas that helped us tell that complete story. That's it. Thoughts, comments, questions?
Yeah, if you have anything to say, please do say it in the chat. I try to provide some of the links. I think one of the interesting things is how like standardized this all is. Like Cisco didn't go and redo and rebuild and make their own standards on everything. They're following NIST, they're following the MITRE, they're following all these types of things. They're allowing third-party integrations. I think it's such a great way to see Cisco pivot in this way. Um, I do have a question. Jason, do you have any successes you've seen, some XDR like wins that you could share?
Well, yeah, I've got 2 customers that come to mind. One is in healthcare, and the other is is a university. In healthcare specifically, again, their time to detect and time to respond was crazy high. And their team was just overwhelmed of following a lot of data that didn't promise anything. So, I always use this analogy. When I first started in networking, I learned how to create a VLAN. And then I created another VLAN, and I thought, I'm godlike. And back my day, you guys saw the beard at the beginning, right? Back in my day, that was like we were considered godlike. And then you figured out routing between the 2 VLANs, and it was great. And then you get your first job, and they say, hey, I need to create 1,000 VLANs for each switch, and I've got 150 locations. You end up hating VLANs, right? You just hate it. You think it's great. And same thing in security with false positives. Like, there's nothing worse than the team running down, chasing this thing to come up and find out that it's empty, right? There's nothing to it. And you spent maybe a couple hours investigating, maybe even longer. What for the healthcare industry, a client that I'm talking about, that they specifically loved the tool because it got rid of a lot of that noise, because it started pulling those independent observations that they had to glue together on their own together immediately to tell a story at right out of the gate. They didn't have to do any of it, right? It already started a story, and they knew, listen, this is not just ransomware on one asset. This is ransomware on a specific asset that's already then communicated and spread ransomware to another 15 that's also communicated to other areas within the environment, right? So it tells a story. So they were able to reduce mean time to detect and respond, leveraging XDR. And they have some Cisco security, a decent chunk, but they also had third party. So they had Defender and Sentinel as EDRs on their endpoint. And so and they have Azure infrastructure. So their challenge was, again, every tool has some goodness to it, but they weren't able to bring it all together. And that's what XDR had done. On the university side, the biggest thing for them, it was a team of 3 people, and they just couldn't keep up with all the alerts. So they were just alert fatigue, and this helped them prioritize, the right incidents, or right events that triggered an incident, versus having to manually do that. And they get the ability to have, tier 1 operators do tier 2 activities, where they've had to escalate in the past, and there's only 3 of them, right? So it's like tier 1, 2, and 3. And so, the higher tiers were being overwhelmed with escalations from tier 1 that now tier 1 is handling.
Thank you so much. We will be posting this for everybody else. If you want to send it out, if you didn't get to catch some of it, you want to send it to another partner, another colleague, anybody. Thank you so much again, Jason. This has been awesome. I appreciate it.
Yeah, no worries. Thanks for having me.
I'm going to stop recording.